So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining to our Thursday keynote talk. We have the real pleasure to have one of the founding figures of complex systems research and the creator of several ways of thinking and advancing this field. So I will not like to take much time, as we all know who Wolfram is, but I personally want to say that it's a great honor to introduce him, as Stephen Wolfram was for me one of the reasons I did my career path. So with no more introduction, I would like to give the stage to you, Stephen, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, well, nice to join you. I'm not in my natural habitat. As I said, I'm in a hotel in Milan, Italy. And so hopefully nothing will go too badly wrong technically here. I was last at an artificial life conference in 1989. And so it's interesting to be back. In 1989, I had been working on cellular automata and things like that. People used to invite me to theoretical biology conferences in the 1980s, I think because the word cellular was in the name of the kinds of things that I was studying. I'm not sure that it was for any better reason, but it was interesting to be part of kind of the energy of theoretical biology in the 1980s. Around 1985, I thought, hey, I can use cellular automata to study things like biological evolution and do things like evolve the rules for the cellular automaton to get it to do different and interesting things. I tried doing that back at that time. It didn't work. Many years went by. Many different things that I've done in science and technology, building this kind of tower of capabilities, particularly in 2019, launched our physics project and made a huge amount of progress in understanding kind of the machine code of physics. That got me energized to try and see whether the paradigm that we developed for that could be applied to other kinds of areas. So last year, I decided, okay, I'll try and look at the experiment that I had done back in the mid-1980s on cellular automata as models of biological evolution. I'll try it again. And this time I'll push harder to see if I can get the system to do interesting things. Now, there was an important piece of intuition that intervened between 1985 and 2024, which was the success of machine learning. And it will turn out that there's a great commonality between the way things work with biological evolution and the way things work with machine learning. But the main thing that one learnt from the advances in deep learning in 2011 and so on was that if you bash a system hard enough, it will succeed in learning. And so the question was, would that also apply to biological evolution? If you bash a system hard enough, would it adapt? Well, to my somewhat surprise, I bashed it just a little bit harder back in the spring of last year, and it worked. So let me show you what I figured out. And in fact, what I'm going to do, I'll talk about what I figured out last year, then I'll talk a little bit about what I figured out earlier this year, and then I'll talk about some things that I figured out in the last few weeks that I think are kind of exciting and that relate to the question of sort of what's special about things that we can think of as living systems. And I think this is, I view this as being sort of related to the foundations of thinking about artificial life. Okay, so let me try and share some things here. So by the way, I want to make two meta comments. First of all, the stuff that I've just been working on the last few weeks, you can't yet see out and about in the world. Hopefully you will be able to in the next week or two, we'll see. But the other things that I'll talk about, you can find in my writings website. And you'll also find that any picture that I show, if you go find it in my writings, you can click it and you'll get Wolfram Language code that will make that picture. So if you want to build on the things that I'm talking about, it's something very easy to do by just have sort of ultimately open and reproducible science by having just click any picture, you'll get the code that makes that picture and you can build from that. I'll just make sure one other point, which I'll maybe mention again at the end. We have launched in the last year or two a thing we call Wolfram Institute, which is a non-profit kind of entity that is concentrating on basic science. I've done basic science as a hobby for a very long time, but this is kind of formalizing that a bit. We actually have a theoretical biology effort at Wolfram Institute, and we're about to expand it dramatically. So folks who are interested in being involved in that should let us know. It's kind of, if you care about the kinds of things I'm talking about and you know Wolfram language, so you can actually do the technical side of it, then it's a thing that might be of interest. All right, well, let me talk about, let me start talking about biological evolution. So let's start off with a kind of very minimal model of biological evolution that I started using early last year. Here's how it works. So we basically have, over on the left is kind of an idealized genome that's just a cellular automaton rule. This is a 3-color cellular automaton rule. Over on the right is kind of the phenotype of the creature. Starts from that single cell initial condition of just one red cell. It grows for a while and then it dies out. Okay, so let's imagine now that we start mutating the genome, and let's just move this away. Hold on a second. So in a series of mutations, we just make single point changes to the genome for the system, and the goal, we have a fitness function in this case. Our fitness function is live as long as possible, but not an infinite time. Okay, so then we can make a series of mutations, and along the x-axis is mutation number, and up the y-axis is the fitness. And most of the time, you'll see red dots that are below the kind of curve there. Those correspond to mutations that didn't make it. But let's say that we keep every mutation that is doesn't make us worse off than we were before. Well, what we'll see is that we start off, let's say, from just the 0 rule, and then we keep running, and progressively we make a series of breakthroughs that correspond to sort of making discoveries about how to live longer. So if we look at that series of breakthrough conditions, this is what we see. And what we see is a little bit like what we might imagine seeing in something like the fossil record, where kind of a discovery was made by this kind of idealized organism about how to live longer, and then it kind of embellished that discovery to live still longer, and eventually we got to the thing on the right. If we have a different sequence of mutations, we kind of roll the dice another time, we'll get different kinds of sequences of discoveries that get made. We can keep going. Here are some different kinds of things that the system can do to kind of live a long time and increase its fitness. So this is a very minimal model for biological evolution. What I find interesting is that we see that the solutions which are being come up with, there are kind of ideas, the ideas get built on. The solutions are mostly quite ornate. They're mostly not things where we can readily look at it and say we understand the mechanism. Maybe that one on the bottom there is one that is closer to having something where we can kind of explain the mechanism of what's going on. So so what can we say about kind of how things are working here? This model is simple enough that in an even simpler case, we can just trace out all possible mutations. So this is what we call a multi-way graph, the kind of thing that actually was developed particularly for our physics project. Actually, I first looked at these in the early 1990s, but it really came to life for our physics project because it's part of the story of how quantum mechanics works in the physical universe. But here, we're just treating this as a graph of all possible mutations, and we're going sort of, as we go down the page, we're looking at down the page corresponds to higher fitness as the patterns that we get longer. So we can make this kind of multi-way graph that represents all possible mutations. Actually, we can make a graph. This is just a graph of possible mutations. What we're really doing when we form this kind of multi-way graph that represents sort of going down the page according to fitness we're taking the graph of all possible mutations and we're essentially making a foliation of that graph. We're defining a series of kinds of what it means to make progress in this graph. It's just analogous to what happens in physics when you define simultaneity surfaces in space-time. You have this choice of simultaneity surfaces that depends on your reference frame. Here, your choice of kind of making progress layers is determined by the fitness function. So maybe to kind of skip ahead to kind of one of the big conclusions is, why does biological evolution work? Why is it possible to make progress in the sense of making higher fitness as you go through all of these mutations and so on? Well, I think in the end, the big picture is that sort of the dynamics of what's happening underneath in the system is what I call computationally irreducible. It's something where this is a computation where you can't figure out what the outcome is going to be without basically just running the computation and seeing what happens. That's a kind of concept that I came up with well, actually in 1984, a long time ago now, and it's something which has turned out to be extremely important in lots of different areas. So, for example, if you're interested in something like the second law of thermodynamics, that turns out to be computational irreducibility is the core phenomenon that leads to the second law of thermodynamics. Basically, the idea is that you have some configuration of gas molecules, they're bouncing around. The configuration of gas molecules is completely information preserving, but let me just show you a picture of that. If we just take some collection of gas molecules bouncing around, the point is we can actually make even a very simple cellular automaton model for what's going on here, where we start from this kind of orderly initial configuration and we end up with something which is sort of disordered heat. So that's an example of a cellular automaton, a one-dimensional cellular automaton starting from an ordered initial condition and then progressing with time. It's a reversible system, so we could put that orderly initial condition sort of anywhere in the sequence. The main thing to realize is that the initial data associated with the system is kind of ground up by this irreducible computational process. And the result of that grinding up is that if we simply look at what happens some large number of steps in the future, we'll see something which we can't deduce comes from something simple except by doing an irreducible computation. In effect, the dynamics of the system has encrypted the initial data to the point where we can't kind of reverse it except by doing this sort of long computation. So then, why is the second law true? Well, the second law is true because as observers of systems like this, we are computationally bounded. We don't get to do in our minds or with our computers or whatever as much computation as the system itself does in going from its initial state to the state that it gets to. So for us, it is we can't distinguish the kind of configuration, this encrypted configuration, from something that just looks completely random. And so we describe it as having higher entropy, because entropy is kind of the number of states of the system consistent with what we know about the system. And in this case, all we know about the system is it seems kind of random. We don't know it came from this particular initial condition, because that would require this kind of irreducible amount of computation to figure out. But now, what we're seeing in biological evolution is we're seeing these multi-way graphs, and we're seeing kind of we can look at a much larger multi-way graph here. What we're seeing is all these possible paths of evolution, and the fitness function is defining kind of a smooth kind of way of going through this space of all possible mutations. It's the smoothness of that fitness function that means that it's possible to make progress as a result of mutations. If the fitness function was something extremely ornate, if every organism, as soon as it woke up, as soon as it was born, had to be immediately, doing calculus or something, organisms would not be able to evolve. It's the fact that there's sort of a coarse-grained fitness function, just as there's coarse graining in looking at statistical mechanics. The coarse-grained aspects the computationally bounded aspects of the fitness function are what allow biological evolution to make progress. And the thing you can do, let's see if I can find a good picture here. In this setup, you can kind of look at as you reach every different configuration in this process of biological evolution, you can ask kind of, what are all the possible directions that you can evolve in from that position? Well, it turns out that it's actually this phenomenon of computational irreducibility that shows you that with overwhelming probability, there will be a way to escape from the place where you are in the fitness landscape. This is one of the unique cases where you can actually draw a fitness landscape for real. There are lots of artists' impressions of fitness landscapes. This is an actual one, and you can actually show, there's a picture showing sort of on top of the possible network of mutations, this shows the actual fitness of different configurations. And so this is a typical evolution path in fitness space that you can look at in this case. So in any case, the big kind of result here is biological evolution works because there's underlying computational irreducibility in the kind of developmental process going from the genome to the phenotype. And that is sort of interacts, there's an interplay between that and the computational boundedness of the kind of things that the environment determines, that lets the environment determine your fitness, so to speak. For me, it's rather charming that this is the conclusion because that's the same thing that leads to the second law of thermodynamics. It turns out to be the same thing that allows us to derive the physics of space-time and also quantum mechanics. It also turns out to be, and I can explain this if people are interested, the thing that allows us to look at meta-mathematics and to understand why kind of higher level mathematics of the kind that we do in sort of doing mathematics as humans, why that works. All of those phenomena are associated with this interplay between kind of the computational boundedness of the observer of the system, the observer is what's relevant in statistical mechanics and so on, and the underlying computational irreducibility of the dynamics of the system. So in biological evolution, that's the fact that the fitness function is computationally bounded fitness function as compared to the dynamics of kind of the actual growth of the organism, which is something computationally irreducible. Well, you can look at many, many different aspects of what goes on. You can look at different kinds of fitness functions. You can look at how well different kinds of fitness functions are achieved. You can look at, for example, you can use aspect ratio of the patterns as another fitness function. You can ask how well that's achieved. One of the things that's really interesting about what you get is almost nothing about what happens is explainable. What you see are things which sort of happen to work. They're kind of computationally irreducible processes that happen to work. They don't have mechanisms that we can readily kind of explain. And I think that's sort of another aspect of the whole story of biological evolution. What biology is doing is it's picking up lumps of irreducible computation and harnessing them for the particular purposes that it has for achieving whatever fitness it has. So let's see, we can look at all sorts of things. We can look at sort of distributions in morphospace of the things that we get. We can look at the relationships between the kind of the probability flow through these multi-way graphs. If you don't know, if you're looking at what's the how many do you get of each of these kinds of species if you have kind of random mutations, and you can see kind of over time different sort of species, different branches, I suppose, on the tree of this very artificial life become popular and then sometimes can die out. If you end up modifying these are other cases. If you end up modifying, where is it? Some of these. Let's see. Do I have a picture here? Yes. If you, for example, if you change the fitness function over time, so you're kind of changing the environment over time, you see all sorts of dynamics in which are the successful organisms and which are not. And sometimes things will come up for a while and then they'll crash as the fitness function changes and so on. It's a rather ornate set of things that can happen as you to the sort of number of each kind of species. And it's in this case, we're able to, we can kind of describe we can look at these sort of different branches from these multi-way graphs. We can look at sort of the different branches that can be taken as sort of life makes different choices about how to achieve the fitness functions it achieves. Well, you can one thing you can ask about is, can you tell if something was selected or was just a random sequence? And at the level of the genotype, you cannot tell. At the level of the phenotype, we'll talk about the extent to which you can tell. You can do all these kinds of things perfectly well for two-dimensional cellular automata or for Turing machines, for all sorts of other kinds of things. I might just mention something when we're talking about sort of what's random and what's selected. One of the interesting comparisons we can make is to human engineering. So a very cool case of that is the game of life cellular automaton, because there's 60 years of history in the game of life cellular automaton of people essentially trying to engineer structures in the game of life. If you look at kind of the time course of the game of life, you see things that look a lot like other kinds of cellular automaton things that I've studied a bunch. For whatever reason, people studying the game of life never looked at these kind of space-time slices, which are quite revealing. But in kind of the studying the game of life, people have made various kinds of constructions like the glider gun and so on. And there's sort of a question of kind of the arc of progress over time as one looks at, for example, the oscillators that have been discovered in the game of life as a function of the year in which they were discovered. And you can kind of see how the number of different oscillators that have been discovered grows over time. You can kind of see this is kind of human engineering at work that is discovering all these kinds of things. It is rather interesting that some of these oscillators were discovered by explicit engineering, by incrementally putting pieces together. Others were discovered by searches in kind of this space of possibilities. And what turns out to be very common is that there's kind of a spark of computational irreducibility that is discovered by simply searching the space of possibilities. And then there's kind of an engineering harness that is put around that spark of computational irreducibility. You can kind of get some sense of that by looking at the modularity of different patterns. Patterns that were sort of just discovered by exhaustively searching the space of possibilities tend to have very little modularity. Patterns that were made by sort of explicit construction by humans tend to have a lot of modularity. It's this whole issue of kind of using sparks of computational irreducibility as kind of a source of magic, in a sense, for getting things to happen is a theme that we'll kind of see repeated. By the way, you can do all sorts of things in studying game of life. You can do all sorts of things about looking at the actual sort of history of engineering discoveries and how they played out. I'll just make a different comment about machine learning. So in typical machine learning, you'll look at neural nets. It's pretty hard to visualize neural nets. When they get complicated, it's just a big bundle of wires, so to speak. And if you start plotting kind of the behavior of the neural net as a function of its input, this is what I have here is just a neural net, but it has one input, one output. It's been trained to generate that function on the right by the weights in the neural net. Well, so can we make a version of this where we can understand a bit more what's going on? So the first thing you can do is you can just use a grid of neurons rather than using sort of a fully connected kind of thing. You can, still pretty complicated as you train the neural net. You'll see its weights kind of wiggling around in this complicated way. You'll see little breakthroughs getting made in the which you can see in the fitness function and so on. This is that's loss functions. But in any case, you can go on and make an even simpler version of something like a neural net, actually very similar to what I was doing in biological evolution, except that now, instead of having a genome that is applied uniformly at every cell in a cellular automaton, instead of that, we take a cellular automaton. It's actually something I looked at in 1986, but didn't come up with these conclusions at that time. where you have at every cell of the cellular automaton, you can pick one of two possible rules to use. For example, a rule that does that thing on the left or a rule that does the thing on the right. Okay, so depending on which rule, the pattern of rules that get picked in this array, you'll have different behavior if you feed in some input. So let's say that what we want to do is have something where we feed in an initial single bit and we want the thing to sort of exist for 50 steps and then die out, to have kind of black cells for 50 steps and then die out. We can do we can do machine learning basically by just flipping bits in this pattern, that these are sort of very idealized neural net weights in this kind of array. In the cellular automaton array, we get a standard kind of fitness function, tipped upside down loss function. And what's interesting is, as we roll the dice different times, we see very different solutions to the problem of living for 50 steps and then dying out. Occasionally, those solutions are very explainable. Much of the time, the solutions are just sort of lumps of computational irreducibility. You can keep going and you can, for example, that picture that I showed at the beginning of learning that function, the square wave function, you can do the same kind of thing with this very discretized idealization of a neural net. And what you find is, again, that the solution, the thing that is the trained neural net, is not something explainable. It's something that is sort of this, it is this thing which sort of leverages irreducible computation and just happens to work and give the result you want. So you can go through, and I've studied quite a lot else about machine learning in this way. The main bottom line is that machine learning is an example, very much like biological evolution, of leveraging the power of irreducible computation, but doing so where it just picks up these blobs of irreducible computation and harnesses them for the particular purposes we want. So again, the reason machine learning works is because the things you're trying to train to, essentially the fitness function, is computationally very simple compared to the sort of dynamics of the underlying irreducible computation that's possible in the actual behavior of the system. So, but my kind of analogy for what one's doing in machine learning is, if you want to build a wall, if your objective is to build a wall, one way you can do that is by having a bunch of well-organized bricks and build the wall up that way. Another possibility is you just have a bunch of rocks lying around on the ground, and you're picking up those rocks and fitting them together to make kind of a stone wall. And those rocks are kind of the analogs of lumps of irreducible computation that you can use to achieve the objective you want. But if you ask the question, why is this particular piece of the wall this particular shape, there's no good answer to that. It's just, well, that particular rock happened to be the one that we picked up off the ground making the stone wall, or in our training process with the randomness that we picked in our training process. So it's kind of the story of machine learning and why it works, I think, is very much analogous to the story of biological evolution and why it works. So, okay, given these kinds of things, what can you do with these ideas? So a couple of applications I want to talk about. One is to the foundations of medicine. Medicine is not something that really one has thought about a foundational theory for, but we now have a way to get to some kind of foundational theory. So imagine that we have an evolved organism. The thing on the left, for example, is the healthy evolved organism that's been evolved to live for a certain number of steps and then die out. Now imagine that there are perturbations to this organism in its life, so to speak. So, for example, we perturb that one bit early on in the second panel there, and the result of that perturbation is the organism doesn't live as long, dies out more quickly. The problem of medicine is, given that that perturbation happened, how can we make other perturbations to kind of get back to something like the original healthy version of the existence of the organism? So that's, in a sense, a kind of a minimal model for thinking about kind of what medicine is about. So, you know, you can make all sorts of different perturbations. You can make a whole array of what happens with different perturbations. What are the things that can go wrong? You can kind of start mapping out the space of possible diseases. You can just make, this is kind of disease space. And what's interesting about this is just a sort of machine learning learnt kind of feature space plot, just feature space plot function in Wolfram Language, actually, which is under the hood using all sorts of fancy machine learning methods. But what this is showing is something that you kind of know anecdotally from medicine, that there are sort of blobs of very different diseases, and there are sort of a continuum that goes between different parts of that disease space. So you can make all sorts of conclusions about sort of how difficult diagnosis is and how much information you need from the system. You know, is it enough to know the outer boundary of the pattern to be able to sort of diagnose what will happen? And then there's the problem of sort of, can you find treatments? What can you do to once a perturbation has happened, how can you fix it? And to what extent can you get back to what you had before? You can also start asking, if you make sort of genetic changes, if you have things which are where the genetics is such that you would get just sort of the healthy thing if you make no perturbations, different genetics changes in the rule that don't affect the healthy state can have effects when there are perturbations to the rule. So for example, in this case, we're getting, sometimes it lives less long, sometimes it gets a tumor basically and lives infinitely long. So in any case, you can kind of use this as a way to think about idealizations of kind of the fundamental problems of medicine. Okay, let me talk about something that I've just been working on very recently. That has to do with the following question. It has to do with the question of what is living matter? What is that thing that if we have people in the Victorian period, we'll call it protoplasm. But today we just say it's living tissue. What is it? What kind of a thing is it? You know, we might say, well, it's a bit like a solid. It's not really like a solid. Maybe it's a bit like a liquid because there are molecules bouncing around randomly. Maybe it's a bit like a gel. But in the end, one of the big lessons of molecular biology over the last few decades has been that actually it isn't just a liquid where things bounce around randomly. Instead, there's orchestration at the level of individual molecules. There are active transport processes that are causing molecules to move around and interact with each other in complicated ways. And there's sort of a bulk orchestration of what's happening in living matter, so to speak. And so the question that I've had is, can there be a theory of bulk orchestration? So in statistical mechanics, in the second law and things like that, we have a theory of what happens when we have just lots of gas molecules bouncing around. We know we have the gas laws, we know we have the second law of thermodynamics, and so on. Is there a theory for a bulk orchestrated system? Is there a theory for a system where everything has sort of, in a sense, is working towards a purpose, but we're looking just at the microscopic level of individual molecules? So the question is, if you say that on a large scale, the system satisfies some purpose, it achieves some fitness objective, what consequences does that fact have for the microscopic dynamics of the system? It could be the case that achieving that objective is irrelevant to the microscopic dynamics of the system. We've seen a bunch of examples where it sort of just happens to work, and the sort of dynamics of the system that you have are just sort of a lump of irreducible computation that just happens to do what you want. Okay, so let's take a look at some things here. So this is a different kind of fitness function. This is a fitness function where we're evolving a cellular automaton again for like 50 steps. And we're saying the fitness function that we want is, I want a particular pattern that goes block of red, block of blue, block of yellow. Okay, so these are different solutions for achieving the fitness of these fitness functions. So for example, those middle ones are kind of, these ones here are kind of interesting. I hadn't expected that solution. It's, you know, there are a bunch of stripes, but the stripes happen to line up their phases to get exactly the right result after exactly 50 steps. So if we look at kind of adaptive evolution, we're changing the rule all the time to get to that final state. This is the kind of fitness curve. This is what the actual configurations look like. Those numbers represent the number of errors relative to the configuration we want. So these is kind of how how the thing evolves. And you notice that it goes through that period where it looks very complicated. It looks very much sort of full of computational irreducibility. Eventually, the computational irreducibility is kind of squeezed out to achieve the objective that we're achieving here. So we can look at, what's this? This was, oh yeah, this is just different outcomes that you can get stuck in. So you're doing these mutations and you're thinking about this multi-way graph of possible mutations, and some paths you just get stuck at something which doesn't quite achieve the objective. And sometimes you get those very ornate kinds of patterns that don't quite achieve the objective. So a question you can ask is, let's take a look here. Sorry, this is very new stuff. I mean, I just was, this is hot off the press from a few days ago. So we can look at different kinds of objectives. So in each case here, we're looking at, for example, the one at the top is just a block of blue, a block of yellow, then the one we're looking at before, 3 colors, and then we get more elaborate objectives here. Oops. And as the objectives become more complicated, it's more and more difficult to achieve those objectives. And we're ending up with, well, this one, we're still at 1-bit errors here. This one still has 19-bit errors. That's the best we can do. We can look at a few other examples here. These are other cases where, in some cases, it's very easy to achieve that objective. In other cases, it's difficult to achieve that objective. So we can define what I'm calling mutational complexity. How difficult is it to achieve this objective by a series of random mutations? And we can start looking at different kinds of configurations and ask sort of what is their mutational complexity? And we can look at these different things we're trying to get to, and we can see that the things on the left have low mutational complexity, things on the right have high mutational complexity. We can ask things about how does mutational complexity correlate with other kinds of things that we can look at. And somewhere here, I might have a picture. Do I have a picture? Is this it? Yes. So this is, well, actually, this is a slightly different picture. This is a picture of, see, this is what happens if you're looking at things that I just made very recently. These are but basically sort of simple kinds of compression of the kinds that the compress function in Wolfram Language, which is essentially using dictionary compression type methods, uses, correlates pretty well with mutational complexity. So kind of the, and that is kind of reflects the fact that you see in these different cases, you see this kind of, well, you're seeing the various kinds of repeated motifs and so on. Actually, this is a picture maybe I should describe. This is a picture about the progressive evolution and looking at the kind of compressed size of patterns as a function of adaptive evolution steps. And so what you see happening is that kind of what the picture has kind of suggested is that you initially see very low you're seeing only very simple patterns, but they're actually far away from having achieved the objective. You go through a period where the system sort of plays the field and uses computational irreducibility to explore lots of different kinds of directions. And then eventually the computational irreducibility is kind of squeezed out as it gets towards its final fitness objective. So what is interesting to see, I think, is that what happens is the fact that there is an overall fitness objective ends up having a consequence for the actual, for the microscopic structure of the system. So in a sense, what's happening is there's a way in which this large scale sort of purpose to the system sort of trickles down. It's sort of a downward causation type process where it trickles down to have an effect on the small scale structure of the system. If you don't run for as many steps as the mutational complexity of the thing you are trying to fit, then you will not see this phenomenon. But as you get closer to having sort of achieved your fitness objective, you will see more and more of this kind of squeezing out of computational irreducibility. Well, there are plenty of things where you just can't get there. So these are pictures of multi-way graphs of kind of different, this was trying to achieve a particular fitness objective, and you can sometimes get stuck and not being able to achieve that objective. But you can look at all sorts of different fitness functions. So these are now vertical columns. We're looking at trying to achieve those fitness functions. There are different ways that those are achieved. You can look at fitness functions. What are these? These are fitness functions which are more global fitness functions, where you are asking for configurations where the total number of red, blue, and yellow cells after 50 steps is equal. So it's a global constraint. And you can see how that ends up being satisfied and what kinds of configurations satisfy that. Or you can look at, what are some of these other ones? Oh, this is a fun one. This is looking at different average angles of growth of these patterns. And so you can achieve many of those angles of growth. This is the way one is achieved as you go through the evolution process. In this case, kind of the computational irreducibility still exists in the center of these patterns, but it's kind of squeezed out when you get into the boundary of the pattern still works that way. All sorts of things you can do looking for, these are unfinished pictures, I'm afraid, but that's what I get to show you. This is looking for different different kinds of fitness criteria and so on. Or you could look for, what are these? These are periodicity, looking for either fixed periodicity or looking for the longest possible period you can get with these kinds of systems. And again, you see the same kinds of phenomena of getting these kind of modular pieces and so on. Okay, so what is the significance of this? The main thing is in statistical mechanics, we can say we just have a random collection of configurations of gas molecules. And simply from knowing that the configuration of gas molecules is random, we can make conclusions about the system. We can use an ensemble and we can say, we're just going to say that the gas molecules are in some configuration that's typical of the ensemble of all possible configurations. If you work with that, you can derive the gas laws, you can derive all sorts of features of those statistical mechanical systems. Okay, so in the case of what we're interested in for biology, I think there's another kind of ensemble that we deal with. I'm calling it the Rulial ensemble. First time I mentioned that, so first time I probably said it out loud, but the Rulial ensemble is the ensemble of rules which are consistent with achieving this fitness objective. So we can imagine this thing I call the Ruliad, which is the set of all possible rules, the set of all possible computations done with all possible rules. But we can imagine this kind of space of all possible rules. If we look, yeah, maybe I should show you a picture of that. If we look at what things look like in a typical configuration, where is this? Here we go. So that's sort of typical, randomly go out into the space of possible cellular automaton rules. That's the typical stuff you see out in that space picked at random. But if you look at something which has a fitness objective imposed on it globally, you see very different kinds of patterns. There's a qualitative difference between the kinds of patterns that you see when there is an overall fitness objective, but it doesn't matter what that fitness objective is. You can look at lots of different fitness objectives, and it turns out that so long as that fitness objective is computationally bounded, there seem to be many features in common between the kinds of patterns you get. So in a sense, what's happening is the fact that there is this overall fitness objective implies that you're selecting a subset of all possible rules, this ensemble of all possible rules that satisfy a computationally bounded fitness objective. We can think of that as a Rulial ensemble. And the whole point is that there are features of behavior that are true in general in the Rulial ensemble. So it might be the case that every different fitness function, you would have different microscopic behavior that satisfies that fitness function. But what seems to be the case is that so long as you know that there is a fitness function that's computationally bounded, that implies that sort of puts downward pressure on what can happen at a microscopic scale. So I think that what I'm trying to do is to build kind of a theory of bulk orchestration that is analogous to statistical mechanics, although it's operating not in the space of configurations of the system, but instead in the space of possible rules for the system. So I'm sort of excited about this because I think it gives us a way to understand, when we look at molecular biology and we see all these complicated mechanisms going on and so on, it's how would we possibly understand what's happening? How would we possibly have a global theory for what's going on? Well, I think there is a global theory, and I think it is this sort of theory of bulk orchestration that comes from this rule ensemble idea that is something where the very fact that there is a fitness objective that is computationally bounded is sufficient to give you sort of a law of nature about how biological tissue works. And it doesn't matter what the fitness function is. It's the same kind of thing as the fact that it doesn't matter what the microscopic sort of collision rules for molecules are in a gas. It doesn't even matter what you're in detail measuring about the gas. It just matters you're computationally bounded. What happens underneath is computationally irreducible. The result of that are these sort of laws of gases that are universally true with overwhelming probability. And so I think one can derive the same kind of thing for things like biological tissue. So I think that's my excitement of the last few weeks. We should probably wrap up here because I want to leave time for questions and discussion. And maybe we can stop there and turn it over for that. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot for this talk, and it's great to see how many. I was thinking you have like sort of every 2 years scientific lifetime work kind of thing. So now, yeah, so fantastic.
Thank you.
I guess if anybody has questions, please raise your hand. We're now clapping. Everybody's clapping now.
Well, thank you. Yes.
And virtual clapping, or write your question on the chat if you have any. So we have a first question.
Eric here. Do you see some rules or laws of biology appearing from your model and experiments, perhaps confirming existing ones? Yeah, it's a really good question. So, one of the things we're trying to do at Wolfram Institute is, we're hiring some biologists because, for example, in the biological evolution models, I'm pretty sure that a bunch of the kind of standard anecdotal rules of biological evolution show up in these models, and you'll be able to quantitatively see them in these models. But, it takes some effort to make the bridge from laws about, animal populations on islands and things to the kinds of things we're seeing in these systems. I will say that a number of, so I don't yet know, but I fully expect, actually, there are a lot of things we already know. There are already a lot of things about neutral evolution, which we can tell are important. That's something which is known from sort of biology, from studies of biological evolution. We know that's important here. It's actually critical to being able to sort of make progress. There are other things where, for example, sexual reproduction doesn't seem to be very important. It's something which people sometimes think is really important in biological evolution, although when you drill down, it tends to be the case that people say, well, it's not really clear why it's that important. And we're certainly finding here that that's not important. Another thing is kind of the way that inventions get made in biology and then built on. I don't yet have a theory for this, but we're seeing kind of I think it's very interesting that you kind of see in lots of these cases sort of a configuration occurs, and then you sort of see that configuration being embellished later on. It's similar to, but different from the kind of human evolution progressions that you see in something like Game of Life. But yeah, this is a sort of a major direction is looking for these kinds of things. I think in the rule ensemble business, I am certain that there will be features of of kind of biological tissue and so on that we can see and understand from this. One of the things to realize is one of the big questions about understanding what living matter is like is to know what the right question to ask is. I mean, it's okay. I'll tell you another prejudice I have about that. I think that in chemistry, we're just thinking about molecules randomly bouncing around. In bulk orchestration, we're thinking about a different kind of chemistry that has sort of this overall purpose to it that's different from just the microscopic motions of molecules. One of the things that is sort of a sign of that is the causal relationships between interactions between molecules matter. In standard chemistry, you just say it's a concentration of molecules, the molecules bounce around randomly, the probability of interaction is dependent on the concentration of the molecules. But here, I think what's going to matter is the kind of causal graph of interactions between molecules. So for example, let's take a look here. I might be able to pull this up. If we look at, let me see here. Let's try and find one of these. If we look, okay, this is a very trivial. Did I share the right screen? Am I sharing the right screen? Are you seeing something useful? Yes, no, maybe. Yes, okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is a causal graph. This is a space-time picture of a bunch of balls bouncing around. In this particular configuration, it's kind of like a Newton's cradle where a ball hits another ball and so on. And there's a very simple causal graph on the right of the relationship between the collision events. If you have a more realistic hard sphere gas, this is kind of a map of the causal relationships between collision events between hard spheres and this gas. And so what I think is the case in biological, sort of molecular biology level, is the causal graph of interaction between molecules will be important. Now, can you measure that causal graph? I kind of have a little bit of a guess that there might be something that is kind of a strange analog of PCR, but in the case of that is measuring essentially the dynamic time evolution of interactions between molecules. But so that's another kind of direction. Let's see, David Blumen is asking, do you need to mutate the high fitness rules or can you just sample them uniformly? What's the link between proximity and rule space and in fitness space? Okay, so if you do exhaustive search and you just sample at random, you will get some big successes if you go on long enough, but most of the time it will be a dismal failure because the actual density of high fitness rules is very low. And adaptive evolution is magically successful at finding them. It doesn't get all of them. There will be some which you can see from the multi-way graph. There are some that are not easy to get to by a kind of adaptive evolution process that's always making progress. There are some that are kind of isolates that you can hit by exhaustive search that you cannot get to by adaptive evolution. So now the question of proximity in rule space and in fitness space, let's see. We can see in the plots that I had of fitness landscapes, you can kind of see the extent to which things that are close in fitness are not close in the successful rules are scattered sort of randomly around rule space. You can see various pictures of that. I think I had some before. So David is asking, is this a form of computational reusability? What you are trying to do is find a slice of computational reducibility within the overall computational irreducibility. That's essentially what the adaptive evolution is doing. It is finding a slice of the system, a slice of rule space that has enough computational reducibility that it can satisfy these computationally bounded fitness functions. So yes, I mean, the fact that within a computationally irreducible system, there are always pockets of computational reducibility is a fundamental result. It's the result that makes physics possible. If it was not for that, there would be no regularity in the world. The fact that there are slices of computational reducibility in this otherwise computationally irreducible dynamics of the universe, those slices of computational reducibility are what we build our laws of physics, what we recognize as the regularities of the world are associated with. And it's basically the fact that sort of we are computationally bounded observers. We have to live in these slices of computational reducibility. And that's why the world seems to us like a predictable place, is because we are kind of existing. We are sensing what we perceive is just these slices of computational reducibility. And it's the same thing that the kind of the fitness in biological evolution, I think, that we're similarly the computational boundedness of these fitness functions that we're imposing is kind of sampling computationally reducible pieces of the space of all possibilities. So we're kind of building up to this through computational irreducibility, but then as we have done enough mutation that we reach the mutational complexity of the fitness function that we're dealing with, we squeeze out the computational irreducibility and end up with computationally reducible kind of behavior. Grisha is asking about ideas about properties of living matter from the perspective of physics. Well, I think I mentioned something about that, about causal graphs. That's something that's never been looked at. So in statistical mechanics, you're mostly using things like the canonical ensemble, where you say that the thing is sort of interacting with a heat bath and you just maintain some average energy. By the way, I should say that the idea that energy is important in things like the second law, it is not. The second law has nothing to do with actual energy and sort of heat energy and things like this. The second law is a computational phenomenon that applies even independent of the existence of a conserved quantity like energy. Once you put energy into the picture, you can start deriving other things about sort of the consequences of the core second law, which is a purely computational phenomenon. So I think that sort of this idea of causal graphs and the kind of causal extent of systems, I suspect that there is sort of a biophysics that can be derived from that, but I don't know what it is yet. We're only a week into this particular direction. David Boomin is asking, what do you think about dynamic fitness landscapes where multiple organisms compete for a niche, changing each other's fitness criteria? Yes, I want to look at that. Years ago, I looked at the question of kind of games between programs. So people study, in I don't know, conclusions about game theory and so on. People sort of say, well, I'll get my friends who are game theorists to come up with some strategies. You don't have to do that. You can enumerate all possible strategies of some program size, so to speak, and you can play them against each other. So in New Kind of Science, I have a note somewhere at the back about games between programs. And actually at our summer school and high school summer program this year, two different people sort of worked on making more progress with that and made quite a bit of progress in kind of mapping out this question of games between programs. So that's kind of a minimal version of this question about competition between species in this kind of universe of possible rules. I think there are some really interesting things to get there. I don't know what they are yet. I mean, my friend Greg Chaitin has studied a bit this question of sort of if you are trying to get, for example, longer lived organisms and you're competing against each other, you're sort of driving into kind of a busy beaver territory, and you're sort of you can always one up things because you can always get further in that competition. But this is something which in the models I've looked at, it's one of the things that's on the list for our theoretical biology effort at Wolfram Institute to look at. Let's see. Neri is asking, please.
How close or far are random functions in this adaptive evolution scheme? Since while no pattern emerges, consider the randomized as a potential useful application?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. What if the fitness function is be random? I mean, there are organisms like if you're a fly and you're trying to escape your predator by following a random flight path, your flight path better not be super predictable, or your predator is just going to know what's going to happen and is going to eat you. So there are places in biology where randomness is a good thing. I mean, possibly in brains, it's also a good thing for learning and so on. I don't know. I haven't looked at that. I think it's a good question. It's sort of what happens if the criterion is be as random as possible. I don't know.
Next, Cedric.
Let's see. Treating the ensemble of rules as a statistical ensemble is fascinating. Thank you. Is there a simple or minimal setup, an Ising model for rule space where this can be analyzed analytically or approximately, but gives non-trivial results? I don't know yet. I only started thinking about this a few weeks ago. That is an obvious question. I've certainly wondered about that. Well, I can show you a little bit of that. Okay, a little bit, but it doesn't get that far. Let me show you what I know so far. Let's see. Well, I can look at, let's see, this is looking at elementary cellular automata. Those are their different possible rules. This is, if the fitness objective is to have a particular configuration of cells after t steps, you're asking what fraction of all possible configurations of cells can be realized, and the answer is the number of distinct sequences, which in general could grow like 2 to the t, actually reaches a fixed value, because after all, there are only 256 rules, 128 rules in this case. And what you can then ask is sort of which patterns can be realized by these systems. You can make multi-way graphs. This is one which is still buggy, that map out what the different possible configurations are. So I think this is probably the minimal model, is looking at matching particular strings with elementary cellular automata. And let's see if I got a few other pictures here. This is showing, showed this before, this is showing that if your objective string is this one here, black, black, white, black, 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 there are some paths through the multi-way graph that reach that string, but there are other paths that get stuck and will never reach that string. And so that's kind of thing one can study very explicitly in this case. My guess is that one can study somewhat larger multi-way graphs and start trying to look at results there. In terms of, and that's something which computationally you can find sort of an exact solution to. Can we get a thing? Okay, so I don't know. I haven't really thought about this. Thank you for asking. I mean, I've thought about this question. I haven't come up with, as I'm talking to you guys, I do think about the infinite dimensional case, because I think that there might be some like in the beta lattice for spin systems and so on, there might be some way of well, actually, yes, I will mention, I did look at mean field theory and how mean field theory does at explaining these things, and it does horribly. Mean field theory is not useful in the cases that I've looked at here. Maybe in some infinite dimensional limit, mean field theory can be more useful, and you can get something closer to sort of an analytical analysis of it. Let's see, David Blumen. It seems like reducible regularities are a function of our cognition, having learnt reductions of fitness increasing computations. Yes, okay. This is the section of this piece that I'm trying to write about the Rullial ensemble that I was just getting to, that hopefully on the train ride I'm about to do, I get to write a little bit more about. This is a very complicated thing. This question of what is computationally bounded, how does that relate to observers of the kind that we are? How does our slice of the Rulliad that we pick because of the senses we have? So I'll mention one thing. I was recently looking at the question of what what happens. Well, this is related to, I wrote a piece about what if we had bigger brains, imagining minds beyond ours. This is, I was just had that, that's a picture of my brain, just for fun, of exploring this question of well, one of the questions is brains of our size, 100 billion neurons or whatever, we can invent things like compositional language. Brains of the size of a cat or dog don't invent compositional language. And the question is, what perceptions of the world would we be able to have if we had a trillion neuron brain or 100 trillion neuron brain? So I was exploring that, but I think the relevant thing for these purposes is kind of a realization I had about brains, which is, what's the point of a brain? And I think in the history of biological evolution, brains showed up when animals showed up, when things that move around showed up. I mean, the big thing that brains do is they take in data at, megabits, gigabits per second from all of our senses. And then the main result of a brain is that it concentrates things down so that we take actions. But the rate at which we take actions is maybe only 10 times a second. We decide the next thing to do, and we start sending it to our nerves to actuate different kinds of things. But so the role of brains is to take huge amounts of input data and concentrate that down to a small number of actions. And I think brains, my guess is that brains were a thing that arose when organisms started moving around. And when a moving organism has to make a decision, do I go left or right? If you're a great big stromatolite or something, you don't have to make those kinds of global decisions. It's like one piece of the stromatolite, one piece of the plant can do one thing, another piece can do another thing. But as soon as you're an animal which moves, you have to make a global decision about what to do. And I suspect that's when, brains, which are our sort of vaunted achievement, probably came from that very mundane origin. And the thing that we think of as consciousness, which is which is very related to the single thread of experience that we get from sort of our experience of the world, I think is related to that need to make a decision. So the whole question of sort of the relationship between fitness functions, what we perceive in the world, how different kinds of things work there. I'm still trying to untangle this. I'm close. I hope I've almost figured it out, but I don't quite have it yet. So I can't give you a clear answer. Oh, David Blumen is commenting our society has a giant collective brain, so the answer maybe is science. Well, that's another question I've been thinking about. When we have consciousness, in our brains, there are 100 billion neurons doing all sorts of different things. We concentrate that down to decide the next word is going to be yes, for example. It could be the case that all those 100 billion neurons are having different thoughts. That isn't how it works. We concentrate it down so that we have a single thread of thinking, we have a single thread of experience. Well, now, what happens with a society? Well, that's a good question, because now instead of individual neurons doing their own thing, it's all of us doing our own thing. And the question is, to what extent is there a coherent direction that emerges from all of that? In a sense, one way to say it is, why is history possible? In other words, if the details of what's happened in the past are, these days, 8 billion people doing all sorts of different things, there's a lot of detail. But yet, for many purposes, we're able to extract a thread of history and be able to talk about what was important about what happened, and allowing us to kind of make deductions about what might happen in the future, although too often people forget history, but that's a mistake. But I think that the question is really, to what extent is there coherent thread? Is the will of the people, so to speak, something coherent? Is it possible, to what extent is there coherence in what happens in society? I've been wondering about this. I think it's very relevant to modeling economics and so on. I haven't figured it out yet. Let's see. David is commenting that our brain is controlling lots of things, including metabolism, the immune. Well, the question of the immune system is kind of a secondary brain. I mean, the immune system has its own quite separate kind of way of figuring things out that has all kinds of interesting features that I think the things that I've thought about are quite relevant to, although one of my kids is interested in immunology, so I stay away from immunology.
Yeah, with this, we have to close the keynote because it seems that you have to catch your train. We're getting an
In a few
alert.
minutes, I have about, maybe we have one more question from Asa here. Let's see. About mutual information. Mutual information is a very weak notion compared to these kinds of computational things. Information tends to be, the way people measure mutual information tends to be with things like Shannon-style block entropy, which is really weak compared to the kinds of computational things that I'm looking at. And thank you. Yes, I need to go catch my train. It's nice to be able to chat with you guys.
Well,
and
thank you very much, and we're glad to have you here. So until the next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.